All right, welcome everyone. Glad to have you all here. My name is Bryant Baker. I am the Director of Conservation and Research at Los Padres Forest Watch. If you're not familiar with Los Padres Forest Watch, we are a nonprofit conservation organization that has been around since 2004. We're based in Santa Barbara, but we work on issues all up and down the central and south coast. And we also work on issues that take place at the national level and the state level. But our main mission is to protect the Los Padres National Forest and other public lands in the region. One of the biggest things that we've been working on for the past 20 years, especially in more recent years, is wildfire. Wildfire, how to deal with wildfire mitigation. And it's an issue that is always pertinent and there's always questions about it. With the recent fires in LA, we thought it'd be good to have these webinars today to try to go over some of the basics, talk about some of the frequently asked questions that people have about fire that we see each year. So that's kind of the purpose of this. I'm going to share my screen and then, all right, let's get started. So frequently asked questions about fire in our region. Remember, you can ask questions at any time via the chat or the Q&A function, but I will try to address some of the more frequently asked questions that we see year in and year out. This is a photo that I took actually from my apartment, not to give too much away about where I live, but this is a really interesting photo. I think it was during the mountain fire of November of last year and we were getting some pretty serious smoke impacts in Oxnard. And that was a fire that actually ended up destroying a lot of homes in Camarillo and burned a pretty large area on South Mountain. So now the key takeaways, these are the most important things I want you to know about fire in our region. These are like the four really big things. So one, wind-driven fires that pose a danger to communities, they are an inevitable part of living in Southern California. They are a part of the landscape. They've been happening for a long time. They will continue to happen. And that is sort of regardless of if we can solve climate change today, we will still inevitably have large wind-driven fires. We may not have as many of them, but we still have them, and we've been having them for many centuries. Fire suppression, this is kind of related. Fire suppression over the last century hasn't really made these large and intense fires more likely in Southern California chaparral. People often think, well, we've suppressed a bunch of the smaller fires over the last many decades, and that means that fuel has been accumulating, and that just makes it more likely that a fire will be bigger in the future. That has actually been shown not to be really true for Southern California chaparral, and I can definitely talk about that here in a bit. Now, knowing those two things, it's important to understand that wildland fuel reduction is ineffective. Really, to put it simply, it's pretty ineffective when it comes to protecting communities from these inevitable wind-driven fires, and in some cases may actually be counterproductive. And then lastly, none of this is to say that we can't find ways to protect ourselves, protect our communities, protect our homes. Mitigation should be focused on home hardening, defensible space, improving evacuation and alert systems, trying to prevent human-caused ignitions, especially those that occur under extreme weather conditions, and reducing future wildland-urban interface development. Wildland-urban interface, I'm going to probably refer to that as the WUI from here on out. That is the acronym, and that's usually how people say the acronym is WUI. We don't say WUI. That's too hard to say. It's too many syllables. WUI flows off the tongue. It sounds a little odd, but that's what people have gone with. Now, let's just really briefly talk about chaparral. What is chaparral? It's an ecosystem. It's actually, think of it more as like a broader category of ecosystems. It's not exactly the same as saying forest, right? So if I say forest, that can mean mixed conifer forest, a ponderosa pine forest, a lodgepole pine forest. Chaparral, the analogous term for forest for what chaparral is would be shrubland, but there are other types of shrublands besides chaparral. There's sagebrush scrub, there's coastal sage scrub, which I am kind of lumping in with chaparral here. But chaparral itself does come in some different flavors, some different varieties, depending on where you are. You can see it's all over the state. It is most dominant here in the southern part of the state, but you can find it in the western foothills of the foothills of the western slope of the Sierra Nevada. You can find it up here in the Bay Area, certainly in the Central Coast area. You can find a lot of chaparral. You can even find it in Oregon. You can find it in Baja California. In the Clama-Siskiyous, it occurs often on serpentine areas, and it kind of gets mixed in with forest. It's this really fascinating, ecosystem, and it is just absolutely remarkable. It's comprised mostly of evergreen shrubs. These shrubs are adapted to our Mediterranean climate, and this ecosystem, it accounts for 9% of California's vegetation, but it is home to 20% of our native plant species. So it is really important for biodiversity in California. And I really cannot stress this enough. It comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes, and it is more than just brush. That's what people often call it. They call it brush. It is very diverse. There are a lot of native shrub species and also herbaceous species that are that comprise the chaparral. And the chaparral is, of course, home to a bunch of different wildlife species, from very common species like the wren tit to more endangered species that you can find, like the California gnatcatcher, for example. Those are species that you really only find in chaparral or coastal sage scrub, and there are a lot of other species in between there that call this ecosystem home. Now, one of the key characteristics of shrubs and chaparral are that they're sclerophilous. That is just another way of saying that they have sort of these usually small leathery leaves that are kind of waxy. They're very adapted to these long, dry summers that we have here in the Mediterranean climate of California. You see a lot of these exact same adaptations in other parts of the world that have a similar climate. So in the Mediterranean, in parts of Australia, in South Africa, and in Chile, those are all areas where we have a Mediterranean climate. We see a lot of the exact same features, and that is because plants have evolved to be adapted to those climatic conditions. And these are some common species. Silk tassel is a good example of one that has some larger leaves, but their leaves still have a lot of those same, leathery characteristics. They're very good at retaining water, especially during these very long, dry summers that we have. Now, chaparral, because of a lot of these things, it is very conducive to fire, right? It's quite a flammable ecosystem. This is not a bug. It is a feature of chaparral. It is not something that we need to think of as a bad thing about chaparral. It just is what it is. And these plants, most plant species in the chaparral have some adaptation to deal with fire. And this is sort of a typical scene in an area that has, this is a pretty common mixture of chaparral species. This is chamise growing here, some different ceanothus. This is mostly hoary leaf ceanothus, and some manzanita in the background there. This is a really good example of mixed chaparral. And it's quite common in the San Ynez Mountains, for example, in Santa Barbara County. But you can tell if a fire comes through here, it's easy for a fire to propagate through the system. That is just something that we need to be better at as humans at sort of understanding and dealing with. It's not really the fault of chaparral that fire occurs, but it is something that we need to be prepared for. So with all of that said, now we're on the same page about what chaparral is. These are the questions, and I'm going to put up a poll real quick if I can find here we go. I'm going to launch this. So now you should see a poll, and I want you to rank these questions in order of what you want to hear about first, right? So give the question that you're most interested in, give that a 1. And then give the question you're the second most interested in, give that a 2, and so on and so forth, okay? And then those answers should start coming in, hopefully here in just a second. It took a minute the last time I did this earlier today, but please, if all of you could try to fill that out, that would be really helpful. I will say that at noon, we covered the historical chaparral fire regime, prescribed fire, fuel break efficacy, and then we also covered what are the best ways to protect homes. We did record that webinar, so you can certainly go back and watch that once we get that on YouTube. But if you want to cover some of those same things, absolutely, we can go through those same things again tonight. That is completely fine. Or I can also talk about like how plants respond to fire, or I can talk a little bit more about the WUI. Okay, we got answers coming in. This is good. All right. About 36% of you have participated. Okay, that number's going up. All right, good, good, good. All right, so kind of out of the gate, let's see here. What people seem to be most interested in are what are the best ways to protect homes, and then followed by looks like prescribed fire and historical chaparral fire regime. Those are also sort of tied. Okay, now we're getting looks like historical chaparral fire regime and what are the best ways to protect homes. Okay, so this is kind of shaping up to be similar to our previous webinar. Here's what I'll do. I will do, it looks like most people are actually most interested in how to protect homes. So let's actually, we can go ahead and cover that. That's fine. And then we can cover after that, we can do the chaparral fire regime and then prescribed fire. How about that? I think that will work. I'm going to leave this poll open in case more of you want to participate, but I will get started. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to click this and it's going to take us right to that section. It's pretty cool. Okay. So this is the most important thing to understand about how fire affects communities, how it burns down homes. People have been surprised. I've noticed this on social media about the Palisades fire and the Eaton fire and the destruction in the Pacific Palisades and Altadena. They've been just surprised at the fact that there are trees standing and still have green foliage next to burnt down homes. And, that has, of course, fueled some conspiracy theories that are really out there that have to do with lasers and all sorts of stuff. But the fact of the matter is, most homes in a wildland urban interface fire disaster, they don't burn because a fire literally like a wall of flames was coming through the community. The way they burn is embers, often being blown miles ahead of the fire, certainly quite a ways ahead of the fire. It has been, I think we can see up to a mile. In a lot of cases, we have seen fires sending out embers and creating spot fires several miles ahead of fires, of large fires under wind-driven conditions. The key takeaway here is that homes burn because embers are landing on flammable parts of the home. They are getting sucked inside the home. They can get sucked in through vents, through windows, through cracks under your door. They can get into your garage, anything where there's an opening to get into the home, embers will find their way in unless you have done things to try to reduce that ember permeability of the home. Also, embers will find that flammable material right next to homes like mulch piles or grasses or leaf litter, anything flammable. If you got a log pile, right? Embers can find that and start an ignition that will then put direct flame right on the structure. Okay, and this is not just homes. This is also any other structure out there. The same things apply. Okay, so you have to understand that first. And this has been well documented in the scientific literature. What you're seeing actually here, this image, this is a home that was built in a giant warehouse. And it was the study where they were blasting it with embers to figure out what sort of construction materials worked, what techniques worked to try to reduce ignition, home ignitability. So we know this really well, and it's something we see over and over and over again. Now, this is why what the science is telling us is the single most important thing that we can do with existing homes out on the landscape is to focus on retrofitting those homes to be more resistant to embers, okay? So that starts with things like non-combustible roof. Most homes have that at this point. That is in large part thanks to a pretty devastating fire in the Oakland Hills back in 1991. Not a very large fire, but it did destroy thousands of homes and it killed a lot of people. And one of the key factors in that fire that was found later was that a lot of homes had wood shingle roofs, and so there was a lot of good work that had been done, that was done after that in the 90s and the 2000s to make sure that new homes were not being built with wooden roofs and that existing homes were getting retrofitted with these non-flammable, non-combustible roofs. Okay, but the roof is not really the only thing here, right? It's an important piece of the puzzle, and it's an important piece that we seem to have put in the right place for now. But I would say the next most important things are having tempered and or double pane glass windows, making sure that those windows aren't going to be weak points where embers can get in. This is important. It's important to not just to make sure that your windows are closed if you have to evacuate. That's a really important thing. But you have to remember that there are going to be there's going to be winds in these types of fires that are putting homes at risk, and those winds can be carrying debris. Those winds can be strong enough that they could potentially damage the window, and you do not want the windows getting damaged because that could potentially allow embers to get in if they break, right? And so the materials that windows are made out of is very important. There are also pressure differentials that can develop where you've got a cool inside of the house and it's pretty warm on the outside, and that can cause issues. So you want these double pane windows especially to help reduce that heat transfer. There's all sorts of aspects of windows that are really important. Now, replacing your windows can be kind of expensive, and so if money is an issue, I would say, a cheaper thing that you can focus on first is focusing on the vents. Vents are a major access point for embers, right? A lot of homes, most homes have vents, and most homes have vents that do have some sort of mesh screen, usually to keep critters out, right? Or to keep leaf litter out, stuff like that. But those screens are usually not rated for embers. And so you need these like 2 millimeter mesh size screens. So we're talking really fine mesh. And there are companies that specialize in making these ember screens for vents. I think that is a really important thing for people to focus on. And it's one of the first things that you can do at sort of a lower cost in terms of retrofitting your home. There are other things, focusing on the patio, if you have open eaves. Remember, any way that you look for where embers could potentially get in and be in contact with flammable material. That is what you want to focus on as much as possible. And this is not something that we're just saying because it sounds good and we just sort of, we are guessing that maybe this will help. There have been a lot of studies on this. These are all different studies. These are just some of the ones I pulled earlier. And a lot of this starts with Jack Cohen's research. He has been doing a lot. He was doing research in the 90s and the 2000s. He was kind of the pioneer in this home ignitability research. And he has a great YouTube video, actually. I actually don't know who. I think it might be the National Fire Protection Association's video, but he's heavily featured in it, and it's called "Your Home Can Survive a Wildfire." And he talks a lot about all of this stuff. And that's a video that was made many years ago. And so he's been talking about this stuff for over 2 decades now. And a lot of other papers have since corroborated a lot of that early work. And so we know that home hardening is what we call it, or retrofitting homes to make them more resistant to embers is probably the single most important thing that we can be doing out there to protect existing communities. We also know that it's a great way to save money in the long run. So we can save $2 for every $1 that we spend on retrofitting homes. So there is an economic component to this. We can save ourselves a lot of post-disaster cleanup cost and rebuilding cost if we just do some retrofitting today. The problem is a lot of people that have homes out in the landscape in certain areas that are at risk maybe aren't financially well off enough to be able to do some of the things that need to be done to make their home more resistant to embers. Of course, there are a lot of people out there that probably can't afford these things, and we encourage those folks to, if you can afford it, to do it. It will save you money in the long run. But there are plenty of people out there that don't have the means to do this. And so one of the things that we've been advocating, and a lot of other groups have been advocating for a long time, as well as scientists that have been studying this, is that we have programs that help get grant assistance, money, financial assistance to the people that need it the most to do this type of work. I noticed that a lot of people on social media in response to the LA fires, they were very mad about water supply issues. It was a lot of like sort of politics, right? It was wanting to be mad at the state government or the mayor of LA. That's all, honestly, I think a lot of that is just a distraction from the real issue. You want to be mad at our state and federal government. There are plenty of things to be frustrated about. And I would say one of the big ones is that despite knowing how important home hardening is, how critical a piece of the puzzle this is for protecting communities, we've known this for decades. We have known this. the state has been consistently not putting really any funding into this at all compared to what they're putting into wildland fuel reduction, especially. So this is an interesting, these are some data from the Legislative Analyst Office of the state of California. And they found that what they show in their analysis, I don't know that they were really trying to show this necessarily, they just were reporting the data, but I put this graph together based on their data. And this is funding that is going to be happening over the next several years in the state. This is from all sorts of different things, pieces of legislation. I want to say maybe, I can't remember if the climate bond is included in this or not, but we have been throwing a lot of money at wildland fuel reduction. Going out into wildland areas, especially forested areas, and cutting up vegetation. That has been where we put most of our money. Only 1% of all this wildfire mitigation funding is going to home hardening. That's 1%. And it's kind of wrapped up in this community hardening category here, which includes home hardening and defensible space inspections, and also better land use planning. And so community hardening, I think it represents like 2% of all of this. And then if you look at just home hardening, it's about 1%. So it is a really measly amount of money that has been put into this critically important part of fire mitigation in places like California. Now, the other big thing is defensible space. I would say home hardening, most important. The next thing would be to focus on defensible space. And defensible space, people have a lot of ideas about what that means. And, we know in California, people often talk about their 100-foot, brush clearance, 100 feet of clearance around their homes. A lot of that is just sort of an oversimplification of what has been found over the last couple of decades in the scientific literature, which is that defensible space doesn't have to be, you just get rid of all the vegetation for 100 feet around in every direction around your home. There has been a lot of good research that has found that you can actually have trees and shrubs and other plants within 100 feet of the home. The key thing, though, the really critically important zone to focus on is this home ignition zone, the 0 to 5 feet around the home. You really do not want anything flammable in that 0 to 5 zone, okay? I want to show you what that can look like. This is a home I just visited recently that had done a bunch of great retrofitting and defensible space work to try to lower their wildfire insurance premiums. And this is what this 5-foot zone can look like. Now, a lot of folks are going to look at that and say, well, that's not very pretty. It's really not about being pretty. It is about protecting your home from these inevitable events. And that this has been shown to be very effective at that. And so, we will probably see that this is going to be part of the newer building code standards in the future. But if you have an existing home out in a high fire risk area, I highly recommend that you look into doing this 0 to 5. No flammable material, no vegetation, no mulch piles, things like that. You can use decomposed granite. There's all sorts of different things you can do. But this is one of those things that it's not overly expensive to do now, and it could substantially lower your risk later. Now, the other thing I just want to kind of drive this home, that defensible space, don't think of this as some sort of like, well, as long as you have the right defensible space, that will, even if your home isn't retrofitted, that'll solve all the problems. Defensible space is primarily outside of that 0 to 5 foot ignition zone. The defensible space really is about giving space for firefighters to be able to, post up and put water on your home. That is often not possible, especially in an extreme fire event. You've got firefighters, they cannot be at every single home. And so they're often like kind of doing triage, and they're figuring out which homes are easier to protect than others. So if you do have good defensible space, that can be helpful in those situations. But again, you can have really like major defensible space. And if your home isn't protected against embers, it may not be that beneficial in the long run. So I want to show you something. This is an area in the Santa Monica Mountains. This is in 1990. You can see it's all mostly chaparral here. This is an area that has had by this point burned several times. So we of course know that this is a high risk area. Still, homes were built there between 1990 and 2024. This is what it looked like in 2024. So you can see these big homes. This is not me. I'm not trying to criticize these people or anything. I don't know who these folks are. I'm just showing you an example of defensible space and what it looks like, and what, even if you have a lot of defensible space, it may not protect you from some extreme fire event. And you can see a lot of these homes, they have pretty serious amounts of defensible space. Like this home has hardly any vegetation anywhere within this 100-foot zone around it. And these homes have maybe more typical defensible space where they do have some woody vegetation that's kind of well spaced out here. But you can see there's a lot of stuff close to the homes here, right? And there as well. Now, this whole area, I'm about to show you what it looks like after the Palisades fire. So the Palisades fire came through here. It was moving this direction from right to left. And let's take a look. So this is the recent post-fire satellite imagery. You can see that these homes were all destroyed or significantly damaged by the fire, despite their defensible space. This home did survive. I would say it had pretty similar defensible space to the other homes, right? It really comes down to, is your structure protected against embers? That's key. And also, when you evacuate, even if your home is protected against embers, maybe you've got your vent screens, you've done everything right? But if you evacuate and you leave your door open or you leave a window open, all of that is just kind of for naught, right? You really want to make sure you have in your evacuation plan you want to make sure that you are able to close your doors, your windows. If you are leaving your home for several hours on a red flag day, definitely make sure your windows are closed. These are all very important things to do, okay? Last thing I'll say is that in other parts of the world that have major fire incidents, like in Australia, where bushfires are a common occurrence and have caused a lot of major damage, just like here in California, they have tried community shelters, fire shelters. So a lot of people that die during these fire events, they die while trying to get out of neighborhoods, often neighborhoods that were built with only one way in and one way out. And you got to imagine you've got a fire that's being driven by 50 to 100 mile per hour winds, like Santa Ana winds. It may not be possible for folks to get out in time. And so I do think it's important that we start to at least look at our community fire refuges, fire shelters. Are they feasible? Is that something that we could implement here, especially in high-risk communities? It's something we see in Tornado Alley. Most communities have more than one tornado shelter. And so when tornadoes happen, people have the option to go to these local community shelters and shelter in place there. Now, I want to just make it clear, though, this is not me saying stay and defend your home. That is a very contentious issue. I think that we need to make sure that people, if we can get people out, we got to get people out. And so the alert and evacuation system part of all of this is extremely important. And we still have a lot of work to do as our communities in this area. All right. So let me look. That was how to best protect your homes. I can talk a little bit more. I can go into some more detail if you guys have specific questions. Okay, let's see here. I want to look at what the next. Okay, so that was what are the best ways to protect your homes, and then probably the next one that got the most votes was what is the historical Chaparral fire regime. So let's go through that, and then I do see that some folks they have specific questions. I will answer those here. Let me see. I'm interested in whether climate change impacts the frequency and severity of fires. I'll actually cover that here in just a moment. And then how do you deal with fire hysteria and people who want to destroy small community forests because of the fear of embers? Great question. We can talk a little bit more about that. And then would reduction of invasive plant species in the Santa Clara River mitigate fire propagation outside that area and extreme Santa Ana conditions? Good question. We do see that there have been many fires in the Santa Clara River, in the riverbed, basically in the riparian zone because of Arundodonax, giant reed, particularly this big grass species. There's definitely a lot of work being done trying to remove that. I think that would be helpful. Whether or not how it would affect adjacent areas is really hard to say. I'm trying to think if there have been any major fires in the riverbed that have actually put homes at risk. There probably have been a couple that have given folks a scare, but I would say the fires that we really the ones that are really putting areas at risk are maybe a little bit more like the mountain fire, sort of on those bigger contiguous areas of wildland. But let me think a little bit more about that as I go through this next stuff. Okay, and then someone asked about prescribed grazing as a vegetation management approach in this conversation, including post-fire vegetation management strategies. Okay, yeah, I can talk about that. I'll talk about that maybe at the prescribed fire section. So let's move on to what is the historical chaparral fire regime. Okay, so here's what we know, and I'm talking about the historical fire regime. This is what we can sort of piece together from a bunch of different pieces of evidence that go back several hundreds of years. We can also look at evolutionary strategies and the way plants are adapted to fire. It can give us some clues. But honestly, we can't really peer back in time to pre-human presence on the landscape. So think of this as a little bit more like, what is the fire regime, the pre-colonization fire regime? What is the pre-fire suppression era regime? When I say fire regime, I'm talking about the sort of larger spatial and temporal patterns of fire in this region, in these ecosystems. So what we know about chaparral fire is that areas burn. So a given area of chaparral will burn on average once every 30 to 100 plus years. Okay, that was what was happening historically. That's ideally what would be happening in the modern era. It's not really what's happening anymore. But what is happening, what happened historically and what happens today still, is that most of the area burned in any given year, it's burning during these large wind-driven fires. We still have small fires on the landscape. We had them historically, and there might have been more of them historically when we weren't trying to put every single fire out. But whether there are small fires on the landscape doesn't really matter that much when it comes to whether or not there are going to be large wind-driven fires. And I'll explain that here in just a minute. The other thing about the chaparral fire regime, so these fires, they should be relatively infrequent, these large, big wind-driven events that burn most of the area in any given year. But what we do know is that fire in chaparral is pretty much across the board, it's going to be high intensity and it kills most or all of the above ground biomass. That is the norm for this ecosystem. And in fact, when you get away from that, if fires were to burn cooler and not burn as much vegetation, that can actually cause problems for a lot of plant species that have evolved to deal with the high intensity fire. And I can talk a little bit more about that here in a bit. Okay, so how do we know any of this, right? There was a really famous study in 1999 that these researchers, they took sediment cores from the Santa Barbara Basin, and they were looking at charcoal layers in these sediment cores. So we can reconstruct, we can go back hundreds of years, sort of back in time. Like if you've ever heard of people looking at ice cores in Antarctica to try to reconstruct past climates, things like that. It's the same concept with sediment cores. And what they were doing was they looked at the last 100 years or so, and we knew when big fires occurred from the late 1800s and into throughout the 1900s. And they were able to look at when did these fires occur and did we see a charcoal layer spike? Like, did we see more of a certain type of charcoal, certain size charcoal? It's actually, it's quite an intricate thing. And if you want to go read that study, I recommend it, but it is a complicated method that they used. But this was really important. And charcoal studies have been a big, important part of understanding past fire activity in all sorts of places around the world, especially in the Western United States. So what they found, though, was that regardless of the era, so they sort of split things up into these three eras. There was the pre-colonization era, there was this pre-fire suppression era, sort of the Mexican-American settlement era or colonization era. That would be like especially the late 1700s, all throughout the 1800s. And then the 1900s was more of that fire suppression era. And what they found was that it didn't really matter when they peered back in time with these charcoal layers in the sediment cores. They found that these large 50,000 acre plus fires were occurring on the landscape. And at least up until this point that they had been studying, they were occurring at about the same frequency. And so what they found was about once every 20 years on average, there was a large 50,000 acre fire somewhere on the landscape where fires can occur under Santa Ana wind conditions, and that smoke gets blown out above, it gets blown out over the Santa Barbara Basin, and that smoke deposits charcoal into the Santa Barbara Basin, and that's the whole idea here, right? That does not mean that every area was burning once every 20 years. It just meant somewhere in this vicinity here, there was a 50,000 acre fire occurring once every couple of decades. Okay, that's really important. It means that's one piece of this puzzle of understanding that large wind-driven fires were occurring historically before we ever started really ramping up fire suppression, and even before colonization. Okay, so that means if there were smaller fires on the landscape, which there certainly were, they weren't precluding the incidence of these larger wind-driven fires from occurring. Okay, another study about 10 years later corroborated those findings using something completely different. They actually took tree ring records from big cone Douglas fir forest, and this is a fascinating species that's endemic to Southern California. And what they look like, these forests, they look just like what you see here in the background here. They're these stands of these big cone Douglas firs that are completely surrounded by chaparral. They usually grow on these north-facing slopes or in canyons, but they are kind of intertwined with the chaparral. And so they were able to also look back several centuries through these tree ring records, and they were looking at fire scars in those tree rings. And they also found that there were large landscape scale fires occurring periodically, and they were burning, multiple big cone Douglas fir stands that were far apart from each other. They were burning them in the same year, at the same time. And so one of their conclusions was, as in recent decades, past widespread fires were likely driven by extreme winds and drought conditions, right? So we have two totally unrelated, two totally different types of evidence that are sort of pointing us in the same direction, which is, hey, big fires have been happening for centuries, okay? Now, like I said earlier, the norm for how chaparral burns is high intensity. This is an area that had burned just a few weeks before. This is up in the Santa Ynez Mountains above. This is Santa Barbara down here. This was the Cave Fire back in 2019. It looks devastating. It looks terrible. It's what people look at this and they think, oh my God, this area will never recover. This is exactly how we expect chaparral to burn, what we expect it to look like after the fire. And it is amazing the sort of process that it goes through to regrow. Most of what you see, these dead stems here, these burnt stems, those are mostly shrubs that are actually still alive. They are able to survive from underground burrows and root systems, and most of these resprout after this fire. And then you have a lot of species that come up from dormant seed banks that are basically, they build up in the soil in between fires and they don't germinate until something like high heat or chemicals from smoke or charred wood stimulate the seed and cause it to germinate, right? So this is important. Now, that image, that was from 2019. We see the exact same imagery in the earliest photographs we have of post-fire landscapes in chaparral. This is from a book called The Elfin Forest from 1923. So these are like early 1900s. This is kind of pre-suppression era. We hadn't really started doing a heavy, hardcore industrial fire suppression in Southern California. And there were big fires back then. And we have these photos that look exactly like the landscapes after a fire today. All right. And so again, this is really important. Fire intensity is naturally very high in chaparral, and it's the norm, and it's what these plants are. They have evolved strategies to deal with this. So don't look at that as necessarily a bad thing. Okay. We also know that fires for a very long time have been affecting communities, right? They're obviously affecting communities to a much greater extent now, primarily because our communities have grown drastically. We have 44 million people on the landscape now. But this was one of the earliest reports we have of a fire affecting a community. This was Richard Henry Dana Jr. He wrote this book called 2 Years Before the Mast, and it was about his time on doing some sea exploration. He actually went to Santa Barbara in about 1834, 1835. And he said that this first part is kind of funny because this is what people always thought in the early 1900s and the 1800s was that places like Santa Barbara, that the mountains were supposed to be covered in forests, but that fire had come through and destroyed all the trees, and then the trees never grew back. That's not what's going on. The reason Chaparral is there is because climatically that is what is limited. It's the climate is limiting those landscapes to that particular ecosystem. Most forest types can't grow under those conditions. But what was interesting is he said there was a great fire that swept the area about 12 years before. So this would have been in the early 1820s. The fire was described to me by an inhabitant as having been a very terrible and magnificent sight. The air of the whole valley was so heated that the people were obliged to leave the town and take up their quarters for several days upon the beach. So even in the 1820s, we had people having to flee fires and take refuge in other areas. And so we have plenty of evidence of this. There's a study in 2009 that really is one of the seminal studies that was looking at what if we have allowed smaller fires to burn across the landscape? Would that have changed the occurrence, like whether or not a large fire would occur? And this study very clearly showed that it really doesn't matter whether or not you've had a bunch of small fires leading up to a year with big Santa Ana winds and ignitions. And what they were finding was that large fires are inevitable on this landscape for a lot of reasons. And we actually, they go into great detail about a fire, which is still considered the largest fire that has occurred in Southern California that we have knowledge of, that we have record of. And that was the 1889 Santiago Canyon fire, which burned most of the Santa Ana mountains, all in just a few days, basically. And that burned about 300,000 acres. They also have some interesting imagery from photos from the 1800s of these big smoke plumes. So all these things that people think are just like totally a novel thing that has never happened before, they've definitely been happening. Now, someone asked about climate change. And I want to stress this. A study just came out within the last 24 hours about the fires near LA, these January fires, and found that those fires were more likely because of climate change. And where we see the climate signal most clearly is in the fact that the fire season is extending. And so we see that dry season. Usually, historically, this was certainly the case, the big fires would occur in September or October or even November, because that's when you get dry enough conditions starting to overlap with Santa Ana winds, okay? And the Santa Ana winds are pretty much always part of the recipe for large fires in Southern California. In Santa Barbara, it's usually sundowner winds, but it's the Santa Anas that are really what drive big fires in Southern California, almost without exception. And so as that dry season extends because of climate change deeper into like December or now January, we're getting deeper into the Santa Ana wind season. And that's a problem, because as long as you have those Santa Ana winds, you have dry conditions and you have an ignition, you have all of the things you need for a very large fire to occur, or for at the very least, a very fast fire to occur. And those are the fires that put communities at risk. And we can see that by looking at the data. We can go back, and this is just what I had time to put together, was going back to the 1970 Laguna fire. That was a huge fire, 1970, 175,000 acres. And trust me, I've talked to a lot of people who grew up in the 60s and the 70s and said, well, back in my day, they used to cut fuel breaks and do prescribed fire and all this or that, and we didn't have big fires. You absolutely had big fires back then. You just don't remember them, or you weren't paying attention. I don't know. But we've had large fires throughout recorded history in Southern California. And some of them have been major, forces of destruction. The Laguna fire destroyed 1,400 homes back then. And that was a major, major issue. And we saw a flurry of activity around like, well, what are we going to do about this? And then we just kind of kicked the can down the road. And then we've seen since then fire after fire after fire destroy communities, and they're all associated again with these extreme wind events, right? And a lot of them are associated. I mean, most of these, I think all of these, yes, all of the big ones that have destroyed communities in Southern California have been human-caused ignitions, right? So that is important. We could maybe do more about ignition prevention, but the fact that these occur, it's not something that's really new. We are seeing more of them, though, because we have more people on the landscape, more unplanned ignitions, human-caused ignitions. We have, power line ignitions are becoming more frequent. and these are tending to line up with really dry conditions and Santa Ana winds. Okay, so those are what are setting the stage for us having these sort of frequent large fire events. All right, so that was the historical fire regime. All right, let's look at some of the questions here. Good questions. I think I want to go right into prescribed fire, and then I'll try to get at some of these questions specifically. You guys are asking good questions. I just want to, I want to make sure I cover as much as I can real quick. So, okay, we understand now fire in Chaparral, it tends to be, it's intense, and under historical conditions, it wouldn't have been very frequent. It's not to say that small fires didn't occur here and there across the landscape, and that we've put those fires out. We still have small fires, and maybe they were more prevalent historically. But what we do know is that, again, the vast majority of acreage, regardless of whether it's the contemporary era or the historical era, the vast majority of acreage was burning under these extreme wind-driven events. Okay, so why is prescribed fire appropriate? What we are seeing now, especially over the last few decades, is that fire frequency has been ramping up in a lot of places. We're seeing that interval between fires get shorter and shorter and shorter. So this is kind of contrary to what people think. People think that we have put out all these fires and that is what makes these large fires, happen and make them more intense. But the reality is we're actually, this has been happening really for the last century. More and more fires have been occurring in the same places. And that's a lot to do with, again, that the human caused ignitions. We have sort of what we call ignition saturation across this landscape. And we have these extreme wind events that happen. And what's important to understand about prescribed fire is that it's actually not very effective at limiting the spread of these large fires under these Santa Ana wind conditions or other extreme wind conditions in Southern California. That's been shown over and over and over in the literature. That's not really something that used to be debated more back in like the 80s and the 90s. It has not really been much debate around that for the last couple of decades. And what we do know, though, is that you can add prescribed fire to these systems that are already experiencing a really frequent fire, and that can cause even more problems. So some species, and I cover this more in the section, which we haven't talked about, and I've done a lot of webinars on this, like how do plants respond to fire? There's an entire group of plants that some of them are related, some of them are not related, but they have evolved this strategy for dealing with fire, which is that they can't resprout. They're what we call obligate seeders. And so when a fire comes through, it kills all of the adults in the population. And the way that their population replenishes, the way it recruits back, it reforms the population, is from this dormant seed bank. And I mentioned this earlier, but for all those years between fires, once they get to maturity, they start building up these soil seed banks, and they're prepping for the next fire to come through. And so that those seeds can then get initiated, their germination can get initiated by high heat or chemicals from smoke or charred wood. And so when fire comes through too quickly after the previous fire, you can lose those species particularly because they need a lot of time to grow to maturity and they need a lot of time to build up their seed banks. This is an example from San Luis Obispo County, where this study found that even 40 years wasn't enough time for this rare type of manzanita that was an obligate seeder. It wasn't enough time for it to build up its seed bank to a sufficient level so that its population could reestablish at the same numbers that it had before the fire. And that's important, right? Not every species is exactly like this one. And we know that some species, they can deal with shorter fire-free intervals, and then some species need longer. But that's where we start to get at that, why we say 30 years, 30 to 100 plus years. That lower limit really has a lot to do with if you get below that, you start having more frequent fire, especially like once every 10 or 15 years or less than that, you start to lose a lot of native species. And as you lose native species, those can tend to get replaced with non-native species. Here's just a very stark visual example of this, not so much the invasive species part, but just how this process works. This whole area that you see, it burned in 2009. This was in the Hezecita fire up. This is in the mountains above Santa Barbara. And what you see, this little patch here burned in the Thomas fire in 2017. So this was 8 years after the initial fire, the Hezecita fire. All these blackened stems here, those are all the species called big pod ceanothus. It's an obligate seeding native species. And you can see where that the Thomas fire didn't burn. You can see where they're all growing and they're fine. But where the fire came through, it killed all of them. And this is 3 years post-fire, not a single seedling in this patch. Right? There's no seedlings, nothing came up from seed because the species, the plant had not even had time to get to maturity to start producing seed in the first place, right? So it wasn't even mature. And this is what we call immaturity risk, where the fire comes through too soon. And so there's nothing there to replenish that population. Now, this is a really small scale example. So I'm not like super worried about this area, but when this happens at larger scales, that's when we have to be concerned because we can actually lose entire species. They can become extirpated on these areas. And this is what this looks like in like the Santa Monica Mountains, where there's been a lot of research on this. Under normal chaparral fire frequency, we're talking that 30 to 100 years fire frequency. This is what chaparral looks like. It's this closed canopy system, not really invaded by non-native grasses and weeds. This is an area, very similar area. It's an area that burned 3 times in 12 years. And so now it's become more of this like savanna-like system where you've got shrubs really widely spaced, and those interstitial spaces are dominated by the plant you see here in the foreground. That's wild oats. That's a non-native grass. And it's an annual grass that dries out really early in the year, and it is very good at igniting. It's extremely flammable, much more flammable than these evergreen shrubs. And so the more that those non-natives get established in these systems, the more likely it is that you get an ignition in the future. And then the more likely it is that fire spreads even under non-extreme conditions, even under mild conditions. And then you get into a feedback loop. It's something we call the grass fire cycle, and it's very, very difficult to get out of. If someone asks about prescribed grazing, a lot of prescribed grazing these days, I think a lot of like sheep and goat grazing, particularly goat grazing, has in the past been focused on trying to reduce chaparral fuels, like actually browsing on the woody material. I am not really in favor of that. I don't think that is a good approach. When the grazing is very much focused on the non-natives, I think that that's better, but it's still very much focused on fuel reduction as a way to try to protect communities, right? And what we consistently find in the literature, in the scientific literature, is that beyond, a certain distance from structures, fuel reduction just isn't making a big impact on whether or not communities are protected from fire. I do think that, grazing could be used right around structures to try to keep the non-natives reduced as much as possible, but it's going to be something that you have to do like every single year because these plants are annuals and they grow back really quickly. And that's tough. So it's a complicated issue. I wouldn't look at grazing necessarily as a panacea. Nothing is really a panacea to any of these problems. But what we don't want is for chaparral degradation to get worse than it already is. And we're seeing a lot of areas that have become what we call type converted to either completely grassland systems or to these like savanna-like systems where the dominant herbaceous species are these highly flammable non-native grasses and weeds. And just to show you some examples of where people tend to think that it's the older chaparral that's been, it's been building up all that fuel for so long that's really where the high risk is. And that as long as, you've got areas that are younger, that burned more recently, or were masticated or this or that, that will help stop fires. I just want to point out that we see time and time again where fires, this was not even necessarily like an extreme wind-driven fire. It was initially, there was like sundowner winds, I believe, pushing it down toward the coast. And it did initially, it was burning in this older growth chaparral. It started up here along this ridge line. And then it got down to this grassy area where this is all mostly non-native grasses and a lot of like, I think avocado orchards down here and pasture lands, a lot of agricultural land. And that fire just went through all of that, all the way to the ocean, and the biggest fuel break of all. And I will say fires do typically stop at the ocean. That is one nice thing about the ocean. There's a lot of nice things about the ocean. Please don't take that the wrong way. But the young growth areas that had just burned in recent fires, a lot of that reburned in this fire. And this was not even an extreme, like as it was burning into these areas, this was not really under the most extreme conditions. Now, when we see more extreme weather conditions, like these Santa Ana wind-driven fires, we tend to see an even bigger lack of effect of young growth chaparral inhibiting the spread of large fires. This was one down near San Jacinto in 2006. There was a large area that burned. You can see all of this burned in the Esperanza fire, and then in 2013, just 7 years later, the Silver fire. About 71% of that fire perimeter was within the Esperanza fire perimeter. Okay, so there was a lot of overlap. And again, that's too short of an interval for chaparral. And so that could have, it doesn't always just happen in one, you get one short interval and suddenly everything's type converted. That's not really how it happens. But as that happens repeatedly, that's when you start to see that degradation of those chaparral systems. But I think the more important takeaway here is that the Esperanza fire did not stop the Silver fire from making a very large run deep into its perimeter. We saw this at an even bigger scale in the 2003 and 2007 fires in San Diego County. So you see the 2003 Paradise fire up here and the Cedar fire down here. The Cedar fire, it was a huge fire. What was that? 185,000 acres maybe, and it killed a lot of people and burned. I don't remember how many homes. I had it on that chart earlier. The Witch Fire 4 years later, huge portions of the Witch Fire were overlapping the 2003 Cedar Fire and the 2003 Paradise Fire. And so again, we're not seeing that young growth or recently burned areas are inhibiting the spread of these large Santa Ana wind-driven fires. And that is really important, and research has found that many times over the last couple of decades. Invariably, any discussion about prescribed fire in Southern California usually ends up at, okay, what about cultural burning? What about Native Americans? What were indigenous people doing on the landscape prior to colonization? Those are great questions. You can read different perspectives on how much indigenous cultural burning was affecting the chaparral landscape prior to colonization. It could be up to like 25% of the landscape was being affected by indigenous fire. Other people think it was a lot less. I think there's two things that you need to understand here. One is that a lot of the most intensively managed areas that were really heavily populated and managed by indigenous cultures prior to colonization, those are the same places that we subsequently, as the colonial powers, subsequently developed into towns, into orchards, into pastures. The LA Basin, for example, highly densely populated area today, same as historically. That was probably the most intensively managed area in terms of indigenous culture. Prior to colonization in LA County. It's the same way with the Santa Barbara coastal plain. We see it with inland valleys close to year-round water sources. That is where the most intensive management would have been likely happening. And now those places are under Costco or Target or freeways, right? And so it's really difficult to establish exactly the scale of all of this stuff that was happening historically. But all of that is a little bit of a distraction from this more important point, which is what can we do today? What is the situation today? And what is very, very different about today than a few hundred years ago is that we have millions and millions of more people on the landscape. We have far more ignitions than we ever had historically. And we have non-native grasses and weeds. We have non-native plants all across the landscape. And so if we have a situation where overly frequent fire is causing invasive plants to spread even more, and we're seeing that degradation of native ecosystems and the loss of biodiversity, adding more fire, whether it's through prescribed fire or cultural burning in some of these areas, is maybe not going to get us where we want to be. It's not going to protect communities from these inevitable big wind-driven fire events. And it may actually be causing the loss of biodiversity, the loss of native species, and the replacement of those native species with non-native plants. So that is, I think, the more important thing to consider here when this discussion comes up. And these invasive plants, I really want to stress this. They are very important when we talk about changes to fire regimes. This paper came out a few years ago. And they found that across the country, invasive grasses were increasing fire occurrence and frequency across a lot of different ecoregions, including our own. And so we do not want to be spreading invasive grasses more than we already have. And intact chaparral ecosystems, even post-fire intact chaparral systems that are under their normal fire frequency, are pretty good at not being invaded by non-native grasses until we start like getting in there and trampling around with heavy equipment, or people trying to do all sorts of stuff in these post-fire areas. A lot of that just is a great way to spread these non-native plants, and we would rather keep these systems intact in terms of native species cover as much as possible. This is an example of an area that was had a lot of fuel reduction activity over, I think it was in the 90s, maybe early 2000s. This was up near Painted Cave in the San Ynez Mountains near Santa Barbara. So type conversion isn't always just you lose all of your native species and suddenly it's just grassland. It can also, like I pointed this out earlier, you can have these kind of conversions to the savanna system. And so you have these well-spaced shrubs, but in the interstitial spaces between these native shrubs is where you get that non-native grass dominance. And we don't want to get into a situation where we are creating these types of systems and then feeling like, oh, well, now we need to go and manage the non-natives in these systems even more. It's just like it's a feedback loop that is very, very difficult to get out of. And this study back in 2012, one of the things they found was that these they call them alien grasses. I don't really use that term, but these non-native invasive grasses, once they get on these sites, they have this effect of greatly expanding the fire season and the probability of a repeat fire. So if your goal is to reduce fire risk and fire occurrence and fire frequency and to try to protect communities, you don't want to end up in a situation where you're spreading these invasive plants in these areas. Okay. I've not looked at the questions. Sorry. I'm going to try to go through some specific questions now. Thank you all for being so engaged, and we haven't lost anyone yet in the attendees list, so that's excellent. Okay, let me see if I can get through some. Hopefully I've answered a couple of these questions. Someone asked specific to fire breaks or fuel breaks, perhaps, are any of the breaks, the fuel breaks or fire breaks planned in the backcountry of the Los Padres useful and or worth it? There have been, I'll just show you this one. These are what fuel breaks look like, but I want to show you the study. This was a study from 2011. Their conclusion after looking at fuel break efficacy in Southern California specifically, including the Los Padres National Forest, that constructing fuel breaks in remote backcountry locations will do little to save homes during a wildfire. So if you're concerned about whether or not these fuel breaks are going to help during these wind-driven events and protecting communities, they generally do not. And there is a more recent study that sort of found the same thing, that fuel break effectiveness its effectiveness substantially declines when fuel breaks are exposed to fast-growing headfire under dry and windy weather. Those are the conditions under which the big fires tend to happen, and the fires that threaten communities tend to happen as well. Also, putting firefighters on those fuel breaks, because fuel breaks are only effective if they have firefighters on them doing suppression activities. Staffing them under those conditions can be really risky in terms of firefighter safety. We don't want to be putting firefighters at greater risk by putting them in these remote areas under extreme weather conditions. And I'll just show you, this is an example of a fuel break. This is the West Camino Cielo fuel break. I think maybe I've shown a photo of that. I can't remember. But this is along a ridge line, an east-west running ridge in the San Ynez Mountains. And you can see this is after the Whittier fire in 2017. It ignited over here close to Lake Cachuma, burned south, up and over the mountains, went right over the fuel break and came down the mountains. And it did not stop down here once it encountered a fuel break. It didn't even really encounter fire lines or anything. It didn't even encounter a recently burned area down here. What it did encounter, though, was a change in wind, and you had winds coming in off the ocean that were sort of pushing the fire back on itself. And so the fact that a fuel break completely bisects a fire perimeter, not a great sign in terms of fuel break efficacy. And we saw the same exact thing in the Palisades fire. These are some fuel breaks near Malibu. the fire was moving this way. So these fuel breaks ideally would be protecting Malibu from this fire. This is Big Rock, if you're familiar with that area. And then this is the area, the same exact area right after the Palisades fire. You can see literally everything in this image burned. The fuel breaks were probably not even staffed. They probably didn't have firefighters there to work on them. And what is harder to tell from this scale, most of the homes that you see here were destroyed. So the fuel break, I would say, pretty low efficacy. Oops, I didn't mean to stop sharing. Let me go back to my presentation. Sorry about that. And then I'll look at some more questions here. I got to get back to my questions slide just in case. Okay, what else do we have? All right. Okay, someone is talking about the Proposition 4 that passed last year. It could leverage up to $10 billion in state funding to enhance wildfire prevention, protect water resources, and support climate adaptation. What does enhanced wildfire prevention mean in this context? I mean, some of that money will hopefully go to home hardening, community-focused stuff. I would say the vast majority of that money is probably going to go to more fuel reduction projects. I remember that graph I showed you of the way money gets spent. It's way easier to just put money into things we are already doing, like fuel reduction, especially wildland fuel reduction. It's way easier to put money into those than to start new programs that we desperately need, like home hardening grant programs. I hope that I'm going to be wrong about that and that more of that money will go to home hardening, but there was nothing really like specific that said this amount has to go to home hardening. And yeah, I have a feeling it'll be kind of more of the same. It's an unfortunate part of Prop 4, the climate bond. A lot of great stuff in that, but I think it did not do a great job on the wildfire side of things. Hopefully that answered that question. I answered the Santa Clara River question, I think. I hope. Let's see. I answered the climate change impacts. How do you deal with fire hysteria and people who want to destroy small community forests because of the fear of embers? Good question. I would just, again, focus on the fact that the most effective vegetation management is right around structures, okay? And the more we can try to focus attention on that, and the more we can focus attention and resources into home hardening, the better prepared communities will be, and the less community destruction that we'll see over time, I would hope. Community forest, that's something communities are going to have to deal with, how to manage those like urban forests and community forest. I do think generally, yeah, there's a lot of panic about fire, and that usually translates into going and cutting more vegetation, often in areas that aren't going to really help protect communities. So I can't give you anything really specific there, other than I understand if you're frustrated about that. I definitely get that. So let's see here. Does replanting after the fire help, or is it better to let it recover on its own? That is an excellent question. I will answer that. Plants here. I'll just show you what it looks like after a fire. I didn't get to show this earlier at the previous webinar. Okay, so this is an area that burned. This was the 2019 cave fire. I spent a couple of years documenting the regrowth on this. I wanted to see it for myself and understand it better. And I'm also a photographer in my spare time, and this was a fun project for me. This is what I just happened to take a photo of this area before that fire. This is what it looked like. A lot of coastal sage scrub up here, and then chaparral, pretty classic chaparral, and even some like bay laurel stands and some lovely stuff here. This all was fairly old, actually, had not burned in many decades. And then it burned in this fire in 2019. And this is just a little bit down slope. This is where I decided to take like a time series photo. And this is what it looked like right after the fire. And a lot of people see this and their instinct is like, oh, we need to go and seed that area. We need to go throw native seeds out there. We got to go plant plants. And I just want you to watch how it transforms. Okay. So this is just 17 months post-fire. So all of what you're seeing are native plants. And you've got wild cucumber was like the first thing that came up, and a lot of seedlings. You've got fire followers within the that first spring growing season. That's a lot of giant flowered phacelia and morning glory. A lot of that kind of goes dormant in the summer. So that's what in the fall. That's what you're seeing here. It's not dead. It's just kind of dormant. And then you'll notice, look at all the plants that are resprouting. So most of those burnt stems, those are actually living shrubs that are able to resprout. Here's another area within this fire. I posted this on Instagram yesterday, I think. This is what it looked like right after the fire, and this is what it looked like a little over a year later. All of this is native. You've got a ton of native plants coming up from seed in between the resprouting shrubs. These areas do not need to be reseeded. They don't need to be replanted. Only, I would say, areas that were already really degraded and were mostly non-native grasses and weeds. Those areas you could do potentially some good work doing replanting there. But out in these like intact chaparral areas, best thing to do is let them recover on their own. They're very, very good at it. And I did it again. That has a lot to do with how plants have adapted to fire. So, okay, let's see here. Steve, okay, you asked about the reference to the recent paper showing the role of climate change. Yes, I don't have it on hand, but if you want to email me, actually, I'll put my email in the chat. If you want to email me, I can send that to you directly. Okay. Do you see any effective way to manage invasive plants at the landscape scale? Excellent question. I wish that I had a good answer for you. I don't. Once it is really, really, there's some invasive plants that I think we can tackle at a landscape scale better than others. I think like wild oats and ripgut brome and sheetgrass, we've probably maybe missed the boat on those. They're really all over the landscape and they're very difficult to get rid of at scale. I have seen it done at small localized scales. I've seen whole areas like get reconverted into chaparral, and it takes a lot of intensive management. It is possible, and maybe we could find like key areas where that can be done, and we can focus more resources on that. But at scale, it's not easy, and it's not going to be like we sort of try and maybe we'll, like we do prescribed fire and suddenly that fixes everything. That's not really how that's going to work. There are other things like I think Arundodonax, giant reed, that's a much more tackleable issue because it is confined to very specific areas like riparian areas. And a lot of like local land conservancies are doing great work on that. The Ojai Valley Land Conservancy, the Santa Clara River Conservancy, they're doing some awesome work on trying to restore riparian areas, get rid of invasive giant reed. So kudos to them. And, I hope that they're able to get more resources to do that kind of work. But yeah, I think honestly, the best thing we can really do at scale is to try to keep areas that aren't so infected by invasive plants, try to keep them from becoming invaded or impacted by invasive plants. Great. Someone did ask, is the ineffectiveness of fuel reduction practices unique to chaparral, or is it the same for other ecosystems? It depends on what your goal is, right? There's some types of fuel reduction, like prescribed fire. It can be totally useful in certain forested ecosystems under the right conditions. It can reduce the subsequent wildfire's intensity or severity. That's been pretty well documented. The question is, can these things stop these big wind-driven fires from going across large areas at a time, in a short amount of time and affecting communities? Kind of regardless of ecosystem, I would say this problem of these fast-moving wind-driven fires going through areas that had fuel reduction or had been recently burned or whatever, that's kind of seems to be common across ecosystems. You see it we've seen it in Northern California in forested areas. We've seen it in the Sierra Nevada. These areas, they burn under fast, really extreme weather conditions, like really dry conditions and extremely windy conditions. And I think the Caldor fire is a great example, unfortunately, where the fire, when it burned down most of the community of Grizzly Flats, it had burned through a lot of pretty intensively managed forest in just a matter of hours on its way from where it had ignited to the community. And I think we should look at those kind of things like that. That's not, if the goal is to protect communities from these big wind-driven fires, then we have to start at the community and then work our way outward from there. That it's kind of a triage thing, right? Like what is most important to us as a society? I think it's to protect people's lives and the places where they live. And the ecosystems are often pretty good at recovering from these events, but communities have a harder time. And so we've got to do what we can to protect communities. And I think we know the answer to that, which is focusing on home hardening and things like that. All right. think I've answered all the questions, I hope. I appreciate everyone's time, and it is 7:46, so we've gone for about an hour and 15 minutes. I'm happy to keep talking. I've I am the first to acknowledge, and I've certainly been told this, that I kind of do lengthy presentations. I tried to break it up this time and make it a little more interactive and not try to tell you everything at once. I have like 90 slides in this thing. I didn't even really get to talk about the LA fire specifically, and that was the same thing at noon earlier today at our previous webinar. So I might try to do a webinar later within the coming weeks about the LA fire specifically. I've done a lot of interesting data analysis, made a lot of maps that I think would be helpful for people. We want all the slides, more on plants. Okay, yeah, I mean, I'm happy to keep going. Okay, I got to give the people what they want. That's fine. I have nothing else to do. This is my life. So, and I enjoy it. But let me see here. Let me get back to. I'm gonna try not to push the escape button as often as I was doing. Let me real quick. I'm gonna share my screen one more time. And thank you all. I appreciate all the interest, and I'll post this to YouTube as soon as possible. Hopefully tomorrow, but certainly by early next week. And then I will send it to everyone who registered. Real quick, I want to find my shares. Here we go. Okay. You guys want to know a little more about plants. I love talking about plants. I never get enough of that. So I did show you these things. Okay, great. How do plants do this? Like, what is going on? I mentioned the obligate cedars earlier. Think of these as the non-sprouting species. This is actually a great example of what this looks like. This is a hoary-leaved ceanothus, most likely. This is one of the few shrubs that I've noticed tends to actually like mostly combust in these fires. It's kind of bizarre. Most of the time you see like a lot of their above ground biomass is still there and it's just kind of charred. I see this really consistently with ceanothus though. And so this was the mama, right? And these are all the little seedlings that were coming up from that dormant seed bank that this adult individual had been producing all that seed for decades since the last fire, right? So this is really showing you that the adults get killed just outright. They can't resprout, but their populations get replenished by these seedlings that come up from these seed banks, right? And these seed banks are really enhance their germination. It's not to say that you can't sometimes see seeds from these species germinating without fire. It's just that that's usually a very tiny fraction of the seed bank. Usually, the vast majority of seeds that germinate, it will be in response to like high heat. That's what you see with ceanothus or with chamise. Chamise can do this too, because it's a great example of a facultative cedar, one that can resprout. That's what you're seeing here. It's resprouting from its basal burl. But you can also see all these little seedlings coming up. Those are coming up from also a fire-cued dormant seed bank. And they're actually responding to mostly to chemicals from charred wood, something we call charrate. And so once the rains happen after a fire, they kind of bring some of that charred wood chemicals down to the seeds. I forget exactly why they respond to that, but pretty fascinating strategy here. And these are the ones that are usually the most successful. These are the plants that you'll often see persist quite a ways. They'll persist even when you have shortened fire intervals. Obligate resprouters. This is actually what a lot of plants fall into this category. These are where most of the mature individuals survive the fire. They don't have a dormant seed bank. Their seeds are usually short-lived. Think about like oaks and hollyleaf cherry. Their seeds don't really persist for a very long time. And the only way that they get new members of recruited into that, we call this recruitment into their population, is in those long fire-free intervals. So after things have kind of calmed down after the fire and all this crazy stuff has happened, then you'll start to see as things are getting back to what you might call normal. I don't really want to use that term. That's when you start to see these obligate resprouters drop in seeds that might actually turn into seedlings. So this is really cool. This was a drone image I got of this area that I really fell in love with back in 2019. It burned in the cave fire is what it was called. And above Santa Barbara, I was going up there like every week. I spent a lot of time tracing through this area as delicately as I could. I fell a lot because it's very unstable. I don't really recommend going into that early post-fire chaparral area. I was trying to do this to document these things to educate people. But yeah, I definitely hurt myself a couple times. It's sort of dangerous. So just be careful if you ever go into these areas. But it was really cool. I got a drone and I could start seeing these things from the air. It was so neat because like you can see the toyon, these are obligate resprouters. They were resprouting really well and were already producing seed. That's what those fruit, you can see the red fruits. You can see these yellowish shrubs over here. That's green bark ceanothus. So a lot of ceanothus can resprout and they can come up from seed. You can even see some of their seedlings, I think, starting to come up sort of amongst all these other seedlings, which are a different type of ceanothus that can't resprout. That's big pod ceanothus. That's most of what's growing in this interstitial space between these shrubs. There's also like hollyleaf cherry. Those are resprouting. Interior live oak. This was a really cool stand of it. And I'm telling you, you look at this a week after the fire, it looks like these plants are toast and like never going to come back. Every single one of them resprouted. Is amazing, but it's normal. And it was only amazing because I just hadn't really got to see it personally myself before. You'll also notice this soil looks kind of different here. And that was actually what was conducive to chamise growing here. It really likes, it tends to do well in this poor soil. Also, there's some manzanita growing there. It's harder to see some manzanita that's able to resprout. There was even another manzanita, big berry manzanita right here that can't resprout. And I was finding its little seedlings coming up there. And so you can see all the chamise are resprouting here, and there's some seedlings spread throughout there. It's an amazing world. And this was just a couple of years after the fire. Pretty cool to see. The other one, I haven't really talked about this, are fire followers. These are species that you really only see on the landscape right after a fire, usually for the first couple of growing seasons after a fire. So this is, again, what it looked like about a week after the fire. You got a lot of, these are like, that's like the biggest toyon I've ever seen back there. And it resprouted really nicely. A lot of shrubs here that resprouted, which you can't really tell. But look at all of this giant flowered Phacelia. You could have come out before the fire. You would not have been able to find a single giant flowered Phacelia, probably in any year for decades leading up to this fire. After the fire, it was like visually dominating the landscape for a couple of years. It was really cool. And now you go back out there now, you'd probably be hard pressed to find giant flowered Phacelia. They just are sort of short lived on the landscape, and they have their moment glory right after the fire. They have big dormant seed banks that are responding to the fire. Really cool stuff. These are all photos I've taken in post-fire areas. I think actually these might have all come from, I don't know if these all came from the cave fire, actually. I think they did. I remember making this slide a couple of years ago, but yeah, just to show you some of the amazing beauty of these post-fire landscapes. It's just fascinating. I like could not get enough of it. So yeah, that's my little spiel about plants. If you want to learn more about all that, I've done so many webinars about that. Go check out our YouTube channel. I've like talked for hours about how plants respond. And I've given presentations to other groups like the Santa Barbara Fire Safe Council and local Audubon societies and the California Native Plant Society locally. So you can go find their recordings as well. Great. Okay. Well, I think maybe I'll leave it there. I would love to just keep going through these, but I think I've been talking for an hour and a half almost. So, and I think we're kind of out of questions. Oh, okay. Someone did have a question. Okay. When we mow the invasive grasses in our WUI fuel break area, are there natives we should sow that would be low fire risk and to try to decrease the invasive grasses? Good question. A lot of species, again, aren't going to really respond and, in terms of germination unless they have those fire cues. So that's kind of difficult. I'm trying to think of some good ones that you could potentially sow in those areas. You want to make sure they're native and that you're trying to get them from like local native sources if possible. Ones that could do well, it's so hard. This is like a tough question and it's hard to make recommendations. There's California buckwheat could potentially come up. It's really about like, what are you wanting to get out of your fuel break? Are you wanting to restore it to something that's more chaparral, or you want it to just be dominated by like herbaceous native plants? That's a good question. I'm gonna have to think about that a little bit more. And maybe when I email everyone the the recording, you'll have my email and you have it in the chat. You can just get in touch with me and maybe I'll have thought a little bit more about it and can give you some better answers. I think I'll look and see if there are any studies that have looked at that. But yeah, good question. Thanks for all the questions. I'm going to end the recording now. Oh yeah, if you're watching after the fact, look through our YouTube channel. We've got all sorts of cool videos, and check us out on Instagram and Facebook, mainly Instagram. That's where we're most active at LP Forest Watch. And you can sign up for our emails, and we'll try to do more educational events in the coming weeks and months about this issue. So thank you for watching, and I will see you another time.